Welcome to Boring Pastimes. In tonight's long wander through forgotten history, we set aside battles and crowns, and instead linger over the quiet details of rulers, towns, and lives mostly forgotten. This is a space for the slow side of history told gently, so you can rest while the centuries unfold around you. Tonight's tale, the story of Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, remembered less for action than for absence. A king whose crown rested more often on his pillow than on his duties. Story 1. How Silk Route traders packed spices and stories. When you imagine the Silk Route, your mind may wander to glittering caravans, merchants haggling in crowded bazaars, and exotic goods being exchanged across continents. But the reality, at least for many traders, was slower, quieter, and more painstaking. It was not the glamour of silk that consumed most of their attention, but the practical details of packing peppercorns, dried ginger, saffron threads, and cinnamon barks so they would survive weeks, even months, of travel across mountain passes and desert sands. The Silk Route, stretching across Central Asia, Persia, India, and reaching as far as the Mediterranean, was less of a single road and more of a web of trails, towns, and trading posts. The flow of goods was steady but fragile, dependent on camels, donkeys. Often came down to how well he knew the art of wrapping small things carefully. Take pepper, for example. To us, a common kitchen spice. To them, a treasure worth carrying across deserts. Peppercorns could be transported in simple cloth sacks, but humidity could ruin them, and moths could burrow into the fabric. Traders learned to line their sacks with layers of waxed paper, parchment, or treated animal skins to prevent loss. Some even sealed smaller batches in clay jars, tied tightly with leather cords, and placed those jars within larger sacks. Each layer added weight, often overlooked by storytellers of history, were what made the difference between profit and ruin. A merchant who lost half his cargo to dampness might find his journey of months ended in poverty, could return with fortunes in spices. Not all spices were equal. In their stubbornness, saffron, the delicate stigma of crocus flowers, was particularly troublesome. Just a breeze could scatter it. Caravans that carried saffron had to guard it with obsessive care. Bundles were wrapped in linen, then sealed in wax boxes, then carried in wooden chests. The monotony, hours spent tying knots, layering cloth, and rubbing wax into seams. The slow work of turning perishable goods into something that could survive an unpredictable world. In one sense, this was history's most boring labor. The bark was brittle, prone, too snapping if bent. Some bundles were carried for over 3,000 miles before reaching the kitchens of Constantinople or Venice. Each bundle told a hidden story of the hands that tied it, the back that bore it, and the tongue that would eventually taste it. And then there were stories themselves, another form of cargo. Traders, moving slowly between towns, became carriers of news, rumors, and legends. Alongside the pepper and cinnamon, they carried tales of distant lands, kings, and customs. A merchant could recount how a certain caravan leader lost half his men to a sandstorm near Merv, or how another avoided bandits by taking a lesser-known mountain path. These stories, passed from one caravanserai to the next, became a kind of currency. Reliable news was as valuable as saffron. The caravanserai, those fortified inns along the trade routes, were where these exchanges took place. Imagine the heavy gates closing at dusk, the smell of dung fires, and the weary sound of camels groaning as they were led into courtyards. Inside, traders unwrapped their goods, not to display them, but to check for damage, to count, to record, to repack. Hours of accounting under dim oil lamps. How many sacks of saffron needed repair? In these dimly lit halls, boredom was the rule. The entertainment was sparse, often no more than a singer with a lute or a storyteller repeating familiar tales. And yet, this tedium held the silk route together. Without careful record-keeping, without meticulous packing, the grand exchange of East and West would have collapsed into loss and ruin. Spices were light but precious, easy to steal and easy to damage. That is why traders often slept near their goods, using their bundles of cinnamon as pillows, or keeping jars of pepper tucked beneath their blankets. Trust among merchants was cautious, but never complete. A misplaced hand, a missing sack, and suspicion could flare into violence. The Silk Route was not only about survival against deserts and mountains, but about the constant, dull vigilance of watching over goods night after night. Even the camels were part of this careful system. Each camel could carry about 150 to 200 kilograms, but distributing that weight mattered. A wise caravan master would alternate loads, one camel carrying dense jars, the next carrying lighter chests to keep the pace steady. Too much imbalance, and a camel might stumble, spilling spices into the dust, where recovery was impossible. The rhythms of packing and unpacking were endless. At dawn, merchants would load their camels, adjusting ropes, tightening knots, testing weights. At dusk, they would unload, inspect, and repack. Every day, the same routine, repeated hundreds of times across a single journey. It was not glorious work. Paper, tied cinnamon with reeds, and balanced pepper jars on the backs of camels. Yet, for all this care, chance still ruled. A sudden rainstorm could soak through packs. A cracked jar could spill peppercorns across the desert floor, might vanish in silence. It leaves you wondering how many treasures of taste and scent were lost forever, not to time, but to careless knots, broken jars, and the indifferent sway of a camel's stride. The spice bundles were tied, the camels were loaded, and the caravan began to move. At first, the sounds of departure filled the air, the creaking of leather harnesses, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft curses of handlers pulling reluctant camels to their feet. But once the rhythm settled, what remained was silence, the steady padding of hooves, and the endless last sound of sand shifting under weight. Travel on the Silk Route was not fast. A well-organized caravan moved at little more than 3 miles per hour. Some days, after 10 or 12 hours, they might only cover 20 to 25 miles, and even this depended on weather, health of animals, and the willingness of guides to continue. The real trade was in patience. The terrain shifted constantly. Leaving the walled safety of a caravanserai meant stepping into a geography that seemed to change with each horizon. One day, the trail ran through stony deserts, flat and sharp underfoot, where wind carried dust into every fold of clothing. Another day, it climbed mountain passes, where snow clung to the edges of narrow paths, and one misplaced step could send both camel and goods tumbling. In these mountains, traders sometimes chose to repack in smaller bundles, shifting part of their loads onto donkeys, or even carrying a few precious jars by hand. A broken jar of pepper in a ravine was unrecoverable. Merchants traveled in groups, not just for companionship, but for protection. Bandit raids were common, though less spectacular than tales suggest. Most attacks were small, sudden, and quick. A handful of armed men would appear at dawn or dusk, when watchfulness waned. They knew where to strike, at the weak points, where ropes were loose, or guards inattentive. In some cases, bandits did not bother with violence at all. They simply demanded a toll, a payment of goods or coin, and let the caravan pass. For the merchant, this was sometimes preferable to losing everything in a fight. Caravan masters had strategies for these dangers. They placed heavier goods in the middle of the line, surrounded by men who could watch over them. The outer camels often carried items less valuable, like wool or salt, which could be lost without complete ruin. At night, the caravan arranged itself in a circle or semicircle, with camels tied close together, forming a barrier. Goods were stacked within the ring, and men slept around them, weapons at hand. It was not romantic, it was precaution, born from centuries of experience. The dangers of nature were more relentless than bandits. Water was the greatest concern. Caravans had to plan each leg of the journey by the distance to the next known well or oasis. Wells could be unreliable, dried out, poisoned, or claimed by rival groups. Oases might shift with the seasons. A single miscalculation could mean thirst, not only for men, but for the animals that carried everything. Traders developed rituals to conserve water. They limited speech during the day, as talking too much wasted moisture. Meals were salted sparingly, as salt only increased thirst. Some caravans carried skins of fermented mares, milk, or wine, not for indulgence, but because they lasted longer than water in heat. Still, nothing replaced the value of a known well. Caravans sometimes sent scouts ahead, risking smaller groups to confirm that water still flowed where it was expected. The animals themselves shaped the rhythm of the road. Camels were praised for their endurance, but they were not tireless. They groaned, resisted loads, and sometimes refused to move altogether. Each camel had its temperament. A skilled handler knew which needed coaxing, which needed firm control, and which carried fragile goods most safely. In a sense, each camel was part of the ledger, as important as jars and chests, requiring management and attention. There was monotony, too, in endless repetition. Every morning, the same labor, untying ropes, feeding camels, repacking, testing balances, setting out. At midday, the caravan might pause, not for leisure, but to recheck knots and straps. Evening brought another round of unloading, counting, repacking. A merchant could spend months repeating these small acts until his hands carried permanent calluses from rope and leather. If you listened closely during travel, you might notice the quiet sounds of trade, not coins clinking or silk rustling, but the faint trickle of spices shifting in jars, the squeak of reeds tied around cinnamon, the crunch of salt crystals rubbing against each other in sacks. These sounds, almost imperceptible, marked the wealth of the journey, and always there were stories. As boredom set in, traders talked. They shared rumors of new markets, a city where saffron sold for twice the price, or a town where pepper was suddenly banned by a suspicious ruler. They spoke of kings they had never seen, whose decrees shaped trade routes from thousands of miles away. They told superstitions, too, of spirits in the desert who whispered to travelers, or mountain gods who demanded offerings of bread. Not all stories were imagined. Some were practical warnings handed down. A tale of a merchant who packed his saffron in plain linen, only to lose it to rain, served as a caution. The story of a caravan that grew too large and attracted bandits reminded others to keep a manageable size. In this way, knowledge survived, wrapped inside memory, passed like cargo from one generation to the next. The road shaped men as much as goods. Some became cautious, their minds sharpened by risk. Others grew weary, their only goal to return home with enough profit to quit. A rare few grew wealthy and powerful, investing in multiple caravans, sending others to walk the roads for them. But most remained in the middle, neither rich nor ruined, just steady carriers of cinnamon, pepper, saffron, and news. Every arrival at a caravanserai brought temporary relief. Inside those high walls, a merchant could rest, drink, and repair. Spices were checked, animals fed, accounts written. Some caravanserais even had small markets where goods could be exchanged without continuing further. But rest was brief. The road always called again, and with it the endless dust, knots, and danger. The Silk Route was not one story, but thousands of small ones, layered together like the wrappings around a spice jar. And each layer carried the same fragile truth. The journey was long, the goods were delicate, and survival depended on constant, often boring, vigilance. Yet, even with all this care, the world could overturn everything in a single moment. A sudden sandstorm could bury a path, erasing tracks and wells alike. A snowstorm in the mountains could trap a caravan for days, draining supplies. Disease could spread silently through animals or men, leaving bundles untouched but useless without carriers. The Silk Route was a gamble disguised as routine. The careful packing, the endless knots, the steady pace, all of it aimed to control what could never fully be controlled. And it leads to a lingering thought. If so much depended on such fragile details, how many stories of lost caravans lie buried in deserts, forgotten, their saffron and cinnamon still sealed in jars beneath the sands? When a caravan finally reached its destination, the sense of relief was immense but understated. There were no cheers, no grand celebrations. Instead, the first moments were filled with quiet practicality. Camels groaned as their loads were eased down. Men rubbed aching shoulders, their fingers stiff from weeks of tying and untying knots. And all eyes turned to the bundles, jars, and chests that had survived the long miles. The goods had to be inspected before anything else. A merchant would kneel beside a chest of saffron, scrape the wax seal with his knife, and slowly lift the lid. If the saffron was bright red, the journey had been kind. If it had dulled to yellow, he knew he would fetch a lower price. Pepper jars were weighed to ensure no one had stolen a handful along the way. Cinnamon bundles were untied, and their bark was sniffed for freshness. It was a ritual of verification, a final test of the countless hours of preparation. Once the cargo passed inspection, the next step was recording. Merchants brought out their ledgers, sometimes wax tablets, sometimes long scrolls of parchment. Numbers were scratched in precise columns. How many jars arrived intact? How many bundles? had broken, how many sacks were lost. These were not the dramatic records of emperors or generals, but the dry accounts of men counting peppercorns. And yet, these ledgers had power. They determined how much profit could be claimed, how debts would be settled, and whether future journeys were worth the risk. Markets themselves were noisy, but not always exciting. A merchant might spend hours sitting behind his chests, bargaining over a single jar of cinnamon. Buyers inspected with care. They rolled peppercorns in their hands, snapped cinnamon bark to test its sound, or pressed saffron threads between their fingers to release their scent. Every sale was slow. Every coin counted twice. Spices did not always travel in straight lines from east to west. Often they moved in stages, exchanged from one merchant to another, passed like batons in a long relay. A jar of pepper packed in India might pass through 5 or 6 owners before reaching the kitchens of Venice. Each owner took a share of profit. Each one checked the jars, repacked the bundles, and added his name to a ledger. By the time the pepper reached a European table, it had carried not only taste, but also the traces of dozens of hands, each leaving its mark in ink or wax. What is striking is how much energy was spent not on producing spices, but on moving them, preserving them, and recording their passage. The labor of farmers who grew the crops was only the first step. The greater challenge was keeping those fragile goods intact across thousands of miles. In some ways, the Silk Route was less a road of exchange and more a system of preservation, a long, slow fight against decay. In the larger cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, traders gathered in markets that served as hubs. These cities became famous not only for their wealth, but for their ability to store and distribute goods. Warehouses lined the streets, filled with sacks of salt, chests of tea, jars of pepper, and bundles of cinnamon. Guards stood watch, and scribes walked in and out, carrying lists longer than some of the caravans themselves. Yet even in these busy centers, life was marked by routine. Merchants did not always sell everything at once. Some rented storage space, leaving goods behind to be sold slowly. Others exchanged their spices for different commodities, silk, wool, porcelain, and prepared to return home. A successful trader might carry spices in one direction and cloth in another. For many, the profits were modest. A jar of pepper might fetch a decent price, but the costs of guards, animals, bribes, and food along the way were heavy. Profit and loss, sustained by the hope that the next journey would be easier or more rewarding. But even modest trades had ripples. Spices carried across the Silk Route did more than flavor meals. They influenced medicine as physicians prescribed cinnamon or saffron for ailments. They altered economies as rulers taxed them heavily, seeing their worth. They shaped cultures as recipes, rituals, and remedies crossed borders with the goods themselves. A jar of pepper might pass quietly from one hand to another, but its impact could spread across empires. Obscurity. Few names survive in chronicles. Historians recorded kings and conquests, not the man who repacked saffron 3 times in a single journey. And yet, their work built the foundation of global exchange. Without their endless knots and careful jars, the dishes of Renaissance Italy, the remedies of Persian medicine, and the feasts of Ottoman courts might have tasted very different. Remembered for its grandeur, but its reality was shaped by ordinary men repeating small, boring tasks. They measured, packed, counted, and walked. They endured dust. They arrived in markets, haggled over peppercorns, and scratched numbers into ledgers. The story ends, perhaps not in a dramatic flourish, but in the moment a merchant closes his ledger at night. He has sold a few jars, recorded his numbers, and eaten a simple meal of bread and lentils. Tomorrow he will sit again, waiting for buyers, counting coins, checking sacks. It is not exciting. It is not glamorous. But it is history. And so we are left with a final thought. If the Silk Route reshaped civilizations through such ordinary labor, how many other great movements of history rest not on drama, but on the unnoticed patience of people who simply packed, walked, and counted. Story 2. The long wait for bread in ancient Rome's public bakeries. You lived in Rome in the 1st century CE. Chances are you did not own land. You did not grow your own wheat, nor grind your own flour. Instead, like hundreds of thousands of others, you depended on the unknown, the grain supply that fed the capital of the empire. And for the poorest citizens, that meant standing in line, sometimes for hours. Outside Rome's public bakeries, bread was more than food in Rome. It was a political promise. The emperors knew that controlling the grain supply meant controlling the people. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was not just a sneer at the people's simplicity. It was a recognition that the crowd's loyalty could be sustained if two needs were met: hunger appeased and boredom distracted. But while circuses offered excitement, bread, lined with shops and insulae, the tall, often precarious apartment buildings where much of the population lived. The air smells of smoke from nearby cooking fires, mixed with the sour tang of fermenting dough. Outside the public bakery, a crowd gathers before dawn. Some hold woven baskets, others carry cloth sacks. Many bring their children, who fidget while their parents shuffle forward in slow increments. The line could be long. Rome's population may have reached 1 million people at its peak, and while not all received subsidized grain, the numbers were staggering. The grain itself arrived by ship, carried from the fertile lands of North Africa and Egypt. Once unloaded at Ostia, Rome's port, it was stored, measured, and eventually distributed to the bakeries. There, state-ployed bakers ground, kneaded, and baked loaves in massive clay ovens that burned nearly day and night. The bread was not delicate. It was not the soft loaf you might imagine today. Roman public bread was dense, coarse, and often stamped with an official seal to prove it was government-issued. The flour might contain bits of bran, husks, even small stones from the grinding process. It filled the stomach, but it did not delight the tongue. Yet, for the poor, it was life. Itself, waiting in line, was part of the rhythm of life. People exchanged gossip: who had married, who had died, which senator had been disgraced. Others grumbled about the length of the wait, the size of the loaves, or the conduct of the bakers. Street sellers appeared, offering figs, olives, or watered wine to those willing to spend a few coins while they waited. For many, the queue was as much a social space as a burden. The bakery itself was a hive of controlled chaos. Inside, bakers and assistants worked in heat and ash, sweating as they turned dough and slid loaves into ovens with long wooden paddles. Slaves carried baskets of finished bread to the front, where officials oversaw distribution. They checked names, marked tallies, and handed out loaves with mechanical efficiency. Mistakes were not easily forgiven. Bread was too important. Even the smallest delays could spark unrest. If a shipment of grain was late, if ovens broke down, or if corruption siphoned loaves away, tempers flared quickly. Hungry crowds in Rome were dangerous. Riots broke out in the streets over bread shortages more than once, forcing emperors to act swiftly to restore supplies. For this reason, grain and bread distribution became one of the most carefully managed systems in the empire. The waiting was tedious, but it connected every person in line to a vast chain that stretched across the Mediterranean. The grain they held in their hands had been planted months before in the fields of the Nile Delta. It had been cut, threshed, carried. 2 riverboats, shipped down to Alexandria, and loaded onto great grain ships that crossed the sea. Storms could delay those ships. Pirates could threaten them. Bureaucrats in Rome could miscalculate their arrival. And yet, if all went well, the result was simple: a loaf of bread, dense and stamped, handed to a waiting citizen in a dusty Roman street. The loaf itself told its own quiet story. Archaeologists have uncovered Roman loaves, preserved by volcanic ash at Pompeii. They are round, divided into wedges, like a wheel, and marked with stamps. Each one speaks of routine, the endless cycle of baking, stamping, distributing. Each one hints at the countless hours people spent in line, waiting to carry that bread back to their insula, to break it with a little oil, or dip it in watered wine. To the emperors, the bread line was both a gift and a tool. Citizens who received free or subsidized bread were less likely to revolt. Grain was a form of loyalty, baked into every loaf, and so the queue outside the bakery was more than a line of hungry people. It was a measure of imperial stability. If the line moved smoothly, the empire held. If the line broke into anger, trouble loomed. The boredom of waiting was its own kind of endurance. People shifted from foot to foot. Children grew restless. The smell of fresh bread wafted out, tantalizing those still far back in line. Hours passed. The sun rose higher. Shadows shortened, and still the line crept forward. There was no entertainment, no spectacle, only the slow movement toward sustenance. And yet, perhaps it was in this very slowness that Roman life revealed itself most clearly. Not in the marble of temples, nor the blood of the arena, but in the quiet patience of ordinary people, standing with baskets in hand, waiting for bread. It makes you wonder if history remembers emperors for their conquests and monuments. What does it mean that their power often rested on something as plain and unremarkable as the length of a bread queue? The bread handed out in Rome's bakeries was the final step in a long, carefully managed chain, one that stretched across seas and seasons. To understand the wait outside the ovens, you must first picture the harvest in the fields of North Africa. In Egypt each year, when the Nile flooded its plains, it left behind rich soil perfect for growing wheat. Farmers bent over the fields, cutting stalks with sickles, gathering them into sheaves, and beating the grain free with wooden flails. Dust rose in clouds, clinging to sweat-soaked skin. This was labor repeated countless times, year after year, each harvest adding to the empire's lifeline. For Rome depended on Egyptian grain more than on marble or gold. Without it, the the great city starved. Once threshed, the grain was carried in sacks to riverboats. These small craft floated down the Nile to Alexandria, where the real work began. Alexandria's harbor was a forest of masts, its docks piled with sacks waiting to be loaded. Here, the grain was transferred to massive ships built for one purpose: carrying food to Rome. Some of these ships were so large they dwarfed the fishing boats around them, with crews numbering in the hundreds. Their holds could swallow thousands of tons of grain, stacked in endless rows of burlap sacks. The voyage across the Mediterranean was slow and unpredictable. Sailors depended on favorable winds, and storms could scatter fleets for weeks. Pirates, though less glamorous than stories suggest, remained a threat, especially in waters near Crete or Cilicia. To reduce risk, grain ships often sailed in convoys, escorted by naval vessels when possible. The empire invested heavily in keeping these routes safe, for they were as vital as any battlefield. Arrival at Ostia, Rome's port, marked another stage of waiting. Ships unloaded their grain onto wooden docks, where inspectors checked weights and tallies. Mistakes here could mean shortages later, so officials recorded every sack. From Ostia, the grain traveled up the Tiber River in barges, slowly making its way toward the city. On calm days, oxen pulled the barges along towpaths, their steady steps setting the pace for Rome's diet. Warehouses called horia lined the riverbanks and city streets. Their thick walls and raised floors kept grain dry and cool, guarded against rats and moisture. Some were vast, capable of storing enough food to feed the city for months. Inside, clerks moved constantly, scratching figures onto wax tablets, marking sacks with chalk, and ensuring supplies matched imperial orders. The hum of accounting filled the air, a quieter but no less important sound than the roar of the Colosseum. From the horia, grain was distributed to mills. Some mills were powered by donkeys, walking in endless circles, turning heavy, grinding stones. Others, more advanced, used water wheels, their steady turning transforming grain into flour. The flour was coarse, speckled with bran, but efficient. It was packed into smaller sacks and sent to the bakeries scattered across Rome. The bakeries were hot, smoky places. Huge clay ovens glowed red, fed with wood hauled in from the surrounding countryside. Bakers mixed flour with water and a little sourdough starter, kneading dough in troughs large enough to hold a man. Loaves were shaped, stamped with seals, and slid into ovens on long paddles. The heat was fierce, and bakers often worked stripped to the waist, their skin darkened by soot. Every loaf represented a victory of logistics. It had survived the harvest, the Nile, the Mediterranean, the Tiber, the warehouses, the mills, and the ovens. Each step required coordination, labor, and vigilance. A single break in the chain, a poor harvest, a shipwreck, a delay at the port could ripple through the system, leaving citizens hungry and restless. The emperors knew this well. Augustus, the first emperor, made grain distribution a central duty of his rule. He created a permanent office, the Praefectus Annone, whose sole responsibility was to ensure the supply reached Rome. Later, emperors expanded the system, even offering free grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens. This generosity was not kindness but strategy. A fed populace was a manageable one, but the system was fragile. If storms delayed ships, lines at bakeries grew longer. If corruption siphoned grain into private markets, resentment festered. Ordinary Romans might not know the details of harvests or warehouses, but they understood hunger. They understood waiting longer for smaller loaves. And when hunger sharpened into anger, the emperors faced riots that could shake the stability of the city. Still, most days, the system worked. Citizens queued with their baskets. Officials stamped their tallies. Bakers distributed loaves. The empire's vast machinery turned grain into bread, day after day, year after year. It was monotonous, but it kept the city alive. There is a kind of wonder in how much rested on such ordinary acts. A farmer swinging his sickle in Egypt, a sailor tying knots on a grain ship, a miller watching flour dust rise in a shaft of light, and it leaves us with a question. If the empire could rise or fall on something as simple as a sack of grain, how secure was Rome's greatness, really? Story 3. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer. When you walk through the Roman Forum today, the ruins of temples and basilicas catch the eye, but beneath your feet, unseen, lies one of the city's most enduring achievements, the Cloaca Maxima, or Great Sewer. Though it seldom makes its way into statues or triumphal arches, this underground river of stone was as crucial to Rome's survival as any army or aqueduct. The story begins long before emperors. In the 6th century BCE, when Rome was still ruled by kings, the city sat on marshy ground. Seasonal rains and the waters of the Tiber flooded low areas, leaving pools of stagnant water where insects bred and disease spread. The Forum, which would one day host senators and emperors, was then little more than a swamp. Building a city of stone required draining these waters, and the solution was bold: dig channels to carry them away. Tradition credits King Tarquinius Priscus, or his successor, Tarquinius Superbus, with beginning the work. Whether or not detail is true, by the late monarchy and early republic, Rome had embarked on one of its first great infrastructure projects. Workers dug trenches through the soft earth, lining them with stone and timber. These channels slowly grew into a network that carried runoff and waste into the Tiber. Over time, they were roofed with massive stone blocks, creating vaulted tunnels, strong enough to last millennia. The Cloaca Maxima became the centerpiece of this system, measuring large enough in places for a cart to pass through. It collected water and waste from the Forum and surrounding hills, funneling it toward the river. Unlike modern sewers, it was not designed to carry away every household's waste. Instead, it functioned more like a grand storm drain, flushing the city of stagnant water and foul smells. Even so, smaller drains and latrine outlets connected into it, making it one of the earliest urban sewer systems in history. Daily life in Rome was tied, however invisibly, to this hidden river. Rain that fell on tiled roofs trickled into gutters, then into channels that led underground. Public fountains and baths drained their excess water into the system, sending streams of soapy runoff beneath the streets. Latrines, both private and public, added their contributions. What emerged into the Tiber was a mixture of water, refuse, and the unmentionable byproducts of a million lives lived close together. For the Romans, this was not a matter of luxury, but of survival. In a city where hundreds of thousands of people lived shoulder to shoulder, filth could quickly become deadly. By channeling water away, the Cloaca Maxima reduced flooding, cleared stagnant pools, and helped control disease. Though far from perfect by modern standards, it represented a giant step toward managing urban life on a massive scale. The sewer also reveals much about Roman priorities. Unlike the gleaming aqueducts that carried fresh water into the city, the Cloaca Maxima worked quietly, unseen, and largely unsupported. Yet the Romans poured enormous labor into its construction and maintenance. Stonecutters shaped massive blocks, engineers calculated slopes to keep water moving, and slaves toiled underground, clearing blockages and repairing walls. These were dangerous, grueling tasks, but essential ones. Ancient authors sometimes mentioned the sewer in tones of awe. Pliny the Elder marveled at its endurance, noting that storms which toppled buildings left the Cloaca Maxima intact. He described torrents rushing through it, so powerful that they swept debris and even animals into the Tiber. To him, this silent infrastructure was proof of Roman ingenuity. Still, for ordinary Romans, the sewer was mostly invisible. They saw only hints, a trickle disappearing into a grated opening, a faint smell rising from the street, or the roar of water echoing through an outlet by the river. The Cloaca Maxima was like the heartbeat of the city, constant, unnoticed, but essential. And yet, if you lived in ancient Rome, you might occasionally wonder what lay down there in the dark, where the city's waste and waters mingled. Was it only a tunnel, or something stranger, a place where the life of the city, hidden and forgotten, flowed beneath your feet? By the height of the empire, the Cloaca Maxima was no longer just a swamp-draining channel. It had become the central artery of an intricate system that linked public baths, latrines, fountains, and runoff channels. It was as much a part of Roman life as the aqueducts that fed it, though far less admired. If you were a Roman stepping into a public bathhouse, you would have felt the invisible reach of the Cloaca Maxima beneath you. Bathhouses were sprawling, complexes of pools, steam rooms, and exercise courts, but they produced immense amounts of wastewater. Heated pools overflowed, and attendants constantly refilled basins. This excess had to go somewhere. Hidden pipes and channels guided it downward, eventually emptying into the sewers. The water rushing through the Cloaca Maxima was often tinged with oil from massages, ash from braziers, or even petals from scented baths. What was luxury above ground became runoff below. Public latrines also connected to the system. These were long benches of stone with holes carved at regular intervals, often arranged over a continuously flowing channel of water. Dozens of citizens might sit side by side, gossiping, debating, or conducting business while relieving themselves. Beneath them, the wastewater trickled away toward the Cloaca Maxima. By modern standards, it was crude, but compared to earlier civilizations, it was remarkably advanced. The Romans had found a way to make communal sanitation both functional and, in its own way, social. But with use came problems. Blockages were frequent. A sudden downpour could overwhelm channels, forcing water and less pleasant matter back into the streets. Rats and insects found their way into the sewers, feeding on what the city discarded. Clearing blockages was unpleasant and dangerous work, left to laborers who entered the tunnels with torches, scraping away debris or reinforcing collapsing walls. The light of their flames reflected off damp stone. Their footsteps echoed, and the stench clung to their skin long after they emerged. Despite these difficulties, maintenance was constant. Rome could not afford neglect. The state employed teams to keep the system clear, and magistrates such as the aediles were tasked with overseeing cleanliness. For the Romans, urban order was a reflection of civic virtue. A clogged drain was not only inconvenient, it symbolized disorder, a city slipping into decay. There was also ritual attached to cleanliness, though the Cloaca Maxima itself was primarily a practical structure. Its outlet into the Tiber was sometimes given symbolic significance. The river was sacred to the Romans, and anything that flowed into it, even sewage, was part of its domain. The act of channeling the city's filth into the river may have carried, at least faintly, a sense of purification. The unwanted carried away by a force greater than the city itself. For ordinary Romans, the sewer was rarely thought of until something went wrong. A foul smell on a hot summer day, a flooded street after heavy rains, or an infestation of vermin could remind them of the unseen river beneath their feet. Yet, most days, it worked silently, invisibly, making the crowded city livable. The Cloaca Maxima was also a monument to durability. Its walls, built of carefully fitted stone blocks, resisted collapse for centuries. In some places, later emperors reinforced or expanded it, but the original core remained. Unlike statues that crumbled or temples that burned, the sewer endured. It was never beautiful, but it was reliable, and in Rome, that mattered. And so, the city depended on it. Every bath, every latrine, every fountain feeding into its flow. A person walking across the Forum might not think of the water rushing beneath the ground, but their life was shaped by it nonetheless. Yet this dependence raised a quiet question. What happens when the system that carries away a city's waste falters? When the hidden river slows, does the surface of life, the meals, the markets, the ceremonies, begin to rot as well? By the time Rome reached its imperial height, the Cloaca Maxima had already been flowing for centuries. Unlike temples that might be rebuilt or statues recast in new emperors' images, the sewer remained much as it had been since the early Republic, a vaulted tunnel of stone, always working, always forgotten. Ancient authors who paused to describe it did so with a mixture of technical admiration and civic pride. Strabo, the Greek geographer, spoke of its vastness. Pliny the Elder marveled that centuries of floods and collapses had not destroyed it. To them, the Cloaca Maxima was more than infrastructure. It was proof of Roman seriousness. It showed that the city, from its beginnings, had been willing to do the unglamorous work of making life possible for ordinary Romans, though it was invisible. They cared more about bread in the bakeries or water from the fountains than about the hidden tunnels below. Yet the very fact that they did not think about it was the sewer's triumph. It worked so well for so long that it allowed citizens to forget it existed. Civilization rests most securely on what no one notices. As the empire expanded, other cities copied Rome's example. Provincial towns built drains and culverts, though none rivaled the scale of the capital's sewer. The idea that a city should manage its waste and runoff became part of Roman urban planning, carried everywhere from Britain to Syria. The Cloaca Maxima was both a practical tool and a model for empire. Time, however, was less kind to Rome than to its sewer. As the empire weakened, public works suffered. The aqueducts fell into disrepair. The baths grew quiet. The forums emptied. But the Cloaca Maxima, fed by springs and runoff, kept flowing. Even when Rome's population shrank in the Middle Ages, the old sewer still carried water to the Tiber. In a city that had lost much of its former glory, it remained steady and unnoticed. Even today, parts of it still function. Modern visitors to Rome can peer through its river outlet, a dark arch disgorging water into the Tiber. Tour guides mention its age. Scholars debate its exact construction phases, but the structure itself simply continues. Its endurance is humbling. Stone, set in place over 2,000 years ago, still guides water beneath the modern city. In this endurance lies its legacy. The Cloaca Maxima reminds us that the most important achievements of a civilization are not always its monuments or its victories. They are the hidden systems that let people eat, drink, wash, and sleep without fear of disease or flood. Rome could not have grown into the heart of an empire without this unseen foundation. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Greatness is not built only on triumphs or beauty. Sometimes it rests on tunnels of stone, damp and dark, carrying away what no one wishes to see. So the Cloaca Maxima flows on, a quiet echo of Rome's determination to order chaos, to tame even filth, and to build not just for glory, but for endurance. And it leaves us with a thought worth carrying. When we measure the strength of a society, should we look at its monuments and leaders, or at the hidden works beneath our feet, the ones that hold everything else together? Story 4. The monks who copied until their hands ached. Story 4. The monks who copied until their hands ached. Picture a stone monastery in the early Middle Ages, its walls thick to keep out wind and damp. The outside world is uncertain. Kingdoms rise and fall, wars burn across fields, and villages vanish under plague. Yet inside, monks bend over wooden desks, quills in hand, copying words they did not write, ensuring that knowledge older than themselves will not vanish. These rooms, called scriptoria, were the heart of medieval learning. They were usually long, narrow halls lit by small windows, with rows of desks arranged under flickering oil lamps. Silence ruled here. Monks communicated with gestures, not voices. A raised eyebrow might mean pass the ink. A tilt of the hand could say that word is unclear. For the work required absolute concentration. The manuscripts they copied were varied, the Bible above all, but also the writings of Roman poets, the histories of Livy, the philosophies of Aristotle, and practical handbooks on medicine, farming, and law. Without the monks' patient work, much of this knowledge would have been lost when libraries in the wider world fell to fire or neglect. The process was slow. A monk would cut a quill from a goose feather, sharpening it carefully with a small knife until the nib was just right. He would prepare ink, often black but sometimes red or blue, made from ground minerals, oak galls, and iron salts. The parchment was stretched animal skin, scraped until smooth, its faint scent reminding the scribe of the creature it once had been, sitting at his desk. The monk would copy line after line, glancing from an older manuscript to his own blank page. Every word required attention. A slip of the pen could alter meaning. To correct mistakes, scribes sometimes scraped off ink with a knife, smoothing the surface before writing again. Other times, they inserted notes in the margins, small reminders that human error was always part of the process. The hours were long. In winter, cold stiffened fingers. In summer, heat softened ink and made hands sweat. Monks sometimes complained. In notes hidden within manuscripts, writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks the back, it dims the eyes, it breaks the belly and the ribs. These were rare glimpses of humor and frustration behind otherwise anonymous labor. But despite the hardship, the work continued. Each manuscript represented months, sometimes years, of patient copying. Decorative initials, large, colored letters, at the start of a passage added beauty to the text, while small illustrations, often whimsical, crept into the margins. Cats chasing mice, monks with exaggerated noses, or strange beasts might appear alongside sacred scripture. These details remind us that even in the most solemn work, playfulness had a place. The importance of the scriptoria went beyond preserving words. They created a rhythm of stability in uncertain times. While wars raged outside, the act of copying continued inside. Each completed book was a small victory against forgetting. The monastery's library grew, shelves filling with volumes bound in wooden covers and clasps of metal. For the wider world, these books were precious. Kings and nobles sometimes commissioned copies, sending requests to monasteries. Travelers brought manuscripts from distant lands, adding to the variety of texts preserved. Over generations, networks of monasteries spread knowledge across Europe, one copied page at a time. And yet, as you picture the bent figures under dim lamplight, you might ask, how much of history, as we know it, depends on the steadiness of their hands? What might have been lost forever in a single slip of ink, or saved only because a tired monk, in silence, turned one more page. When you imagine Rome, perhaps you see marble temples, statues of emperors, or triumphal processions along wide avenues. Yet for most Romans, life was measured in smaller, quieter routines. The clatter of wooden sandals on cobblestones, the splash of water from a public fountain, and the shuffle of feet in line outside the bakery. The distribution of bread, though dull in appearance, was the heartbeat of the city. Families relied on their daily loaves, not just for nourishment, but as the anchor of their meals. A Roman breakfast might be little more than bread dipped in watered wine or spread with olive paste. At midday, bread accompanied cold leftovers, cheese, or figs. Supper, the day's main meal, often featured stews or vegetables, but bread was still the constant, filling the gaps and stretching ingredients further inside cramped apartments called insulae. Bread baskets were as essential as oil lamps. Mothers tore loaves into chunks for children, while men carried slices to workshops or construction sites. Bread traveled to soldiers, to gladiators in their barracks, and to students hunched over wax tablets in dim schools. Its texture, often coarse and heavy, mattered less than its presence. For the poor, bread wasn't part of the meal, it was the meal. This reliance meant the wait outside bakeries was more than an inconvenience. It was a measure of the city's stability. A short wait with full baskets at the end reassured people that the system held. But when lines stretched too long or rations seemed smaller, murmurs of discontent spread quickly. Hungry bellies made for restless citizens. The emperors understood this with sharp clarity. The phrase panem churches, bread and circuses captured the policy. Bread kept people fed, while games and spectacles kept them distracted. Together, they maintained order, but bread came first. An emperor who failed to secure the grain supply could lose loyalty faster than one who lost a battle. Riots over bread were not uncommon. Ancient writers describe angry crowds shouting in the forum, demanding grain when supplies faltered. Once, during the reign of Claudius, ships carrying grain were delayed by storms. Crowds nearly revolted, and Claudius himself was forced to walk through the streets, calming citizens with promises of relief. The message was simple. No matter his power or titles, an emperor who couldn't feed his people stood on shaky ground. In this way, bread was political. A loaf represented the emperor's ability to govern, the empire's ability to organize, and the people's right to survival. Citizens lined up not just for food, but for proof that the empire remembered them. Yet the weight was also social. Standing in line, neighbors exchanged gossip about landlords, magistrates, or gladiator matches. Children tugged at tunics, impatient for their turn. Vendors sometimes drifted along the queues, selling olives or figs to those who could spare a few coins. The bakery lines were part of the city's rhythm, as familiar as the clang of the blacksmith or the cry of water sellers. Inside the bakeries, the atmosphere was thick with heat and ash. Loaves stamped with official seals were handed out, their warm crusts perfuming the air. For some, the moment of receiving bread was a small triumph, proof that patience had paid off. For others, especially those further back in line, it was tinged with anxiety. Would there be enough left? Bread even shaped culture. Poets mentioned it casually, philosophers used it as metaphor, and playwrights slipped it into dialogue. To speak of bread was to speak of life itself. One Roman saying went, "A man who has bread has many problems, but a man without bread has only one." The words may feel blunt, but they capture the simple truth of survival in the city. Over time, innovations appeared. Larger mills increased flour production. Regulations attempted to curb corruption in the distribution system. Some emperors expanded free rations to include oil or pork, adding variety to diets. Still, bread remained the cornerstone. Even when other foods entered the system, citizens measured their security by the steady rhythm of the loaf. Looking back, it is striking how much of Rome's grandeur, its armies, its monuments, its endless politics, rested on something so humble. Not gold, not marble, but bread. The long waits at bakeries, the stamps pressed into crusts, the complaints muttered in line. These were the sounds of an empire sustaining itself. And so the story of Rome's bread leaves us with a thought. Perhaps the true test of power is not in what a ruler builds or conquers, but in whether the ovens of their city keep baking. For in the end, a hungry people can bring down even the mightiest of empires. Story 5. Royal Childhoods. From the cradle to the throne. When you imagine a royal child, you might picture golden cradles, velvet blankets, and halls filled with music. But the reality of royal childhood was more complicated, a life both privileged and constrained, where every rattle and lullaby carried political weight. To be born into royalty was to inherit a role before one had even learned to speak. From the moment of birth, a royal infant was a public figure. Announcements of a prince's arrival spread quickly. for succession was the backbone of stability. In medieval and early modern courts, the birth of a male heir was celebrated with feasts, bell ringing, and prayers of thanksgiving. A daughter's arrival, though often met with less enthusiasm, still carried significance, for marriages could weave alliances as effectively as armies. The nursery was not a private retreat, but a political stage. In France, England, Spain, and beyond, royal infants were attended by nurses, rockers, wet nurses, and governesses, each chosen not only for skill, but for loyalty. Even the milk a child drank was carefully considered. A healthy wet nurse was selected for her diet, morals, and family background, since it was believed her qualities could be passed through her milk. In this way, the child's first nourishment was a matter of state. Clothing was elaborate, but often impractical. Infants were swaddled tightly in bands of cloth, keeping arms and legs straight. This was thought to protect their limbs and instill discipline. A royal infant might be wrapped in fine linens and silks, embroidered with heraldic symbols. But beneath the finery lay the same stiff bindings used for common children. Comfort was rarely a priority. Education began earlier than one might expect. A royal child's first toys might include miniature weapons or books of prayers. Tutors introduced them to Latin, scripture, and courtly manners before they were out of the nursery. Princes were trained in the arts of kingship, diplomacy, rhetoric, the basics of war. Daughters were schooled in piety, needlework, music, and the art of managing households, though some, like Elizabeth I, also received rigorous classical educations. Childhood was less about play than about preparation. Despite the trappings of privilege, royal children were vulnerable. Disease did not spare the high-born. Smallpox, measles, and fevers cut through palaces as easily as cottages. Many dynasties lost heirs before they reached adulthood, plunging kingdoms into crisis. The survival of each child was not only a family concern, but a matter of political stability. Cradles were watched with anxious eyes, for the life within them carried the fate of nations. Childhood rituals were steeped in ceremony. Baptisms were grand occasions, often accompanied by elaborate processions, costly gowns, and symbolic gifts. Sponsors and godparents were chosen from among the most powerful figures in the realm, cementing political bonds. A child's entry into the world was never simply personal. It was woven into the fabric of alliances and rivalries. Yet behind all the ceremony, there were glimpses of ordinary childhood. Letters and chronicles reveal moments of play. A young prince riding a wooden horse, a princess laughing with her nurse, children chasing one another through palace gardens. For a brief time, even heirs to thrones knew laughter, free from duty. But such moments were fleeting, for expectation pressed. In early royal children were often separated from their parents. Kings and queens, bound by affairs of state, rarely played active roles in daily care. Instead, households were established for young heirs, complete with servants, tutors, and companions. These miniature courts were both protective and isolating, shaping children into symbols before they could form identities of their own. And always, the shadow of succession loomed. A child might be adored by parents and praised by courtiers, but the affection was tinged with calculation. What alliances would their marriage forge? What qualities would they bring to the throne? What dangers lurked should they fail to live up to their role? Even lullabies whispered in the nursery could not soften the reality that to be royal was to belong less to oneself and more to the crown. Royal childhoods remind us of a paradox: lives draped in silk, yet bound in chains of expectation. To be born into majesty was to be denied the freedom of an ordinary childhood. The cradle was gilded, but it was also a cage. As we leave this first glimpse of royal nurseries, one question lingers. When the rattles and swaddling bands were set aside, and a child grew into youth, how did the weight of duty shape their sense of self, and what did it mean to carry the crown before even coming of age? Childhood in royal courts rarely lasted long. By the age of 6 or 7, a prince or princess was expected to take on more formal roles. Play was not abandoned entirely, but it was transformed into exercises that mirrored adult responsibilities. What looked like a game of chess was also training in strategy. What seemed like a hunting excursion was instruction in leadership, discipline, and mastery over both land and people. Education was the heart of royal upbringing. A prince's curriculum was rigorous and steeped in tradition. Latin was the foundation, for it was the language of the church, law, and diplomacy. Alongside it came study of scripture, histories, and moral texts. Tutors drilled boys in rhetoric, the ability to speak persuasively, and in the art of governance, from tax policies to the feudal obligations of lords. Physical training was equally crucial. Riding, swordplay, archery, and jousting shaped them into warriors as well as rulers. Princesses were prepared for a different kind of power, though no less demanding. They were schooled in piety, manners, languages, and the arts of diplomacy through correspondence and courtly conduct. Music and embroidery were not trivial pursuits, but symbols of refinement and control. Many were trained to manage households on a grand scale, for a queen's role extended into administration and patronage. In some courts, particularly in Renaissance Europe, daughters received educations rivaling their brothers, preparing them to rule if needed. Elizabeth Tudor, Catherine de' Medici, and Isabella of Castile each emerged from such training as formidable leaders. The household of a royal child was itself a miniature court filled with servants, attendants, and companions. Companions were carefully chosen peers, often from noble families, whose loyalty was to be secured through proximity to the heir. These friendships could shape the politics of adulthood. Childhood playmates sometimes became trusted advisors or bitter rivals. The lessons learned in these miniature courts were as political as they were personal. Discipline was constant. Royal children were rarely indulged, for indulgence was seen as dangerous to future rulers. Chronicles describe strict routines, waking early for prayers, hours of study, meals eaten under observation, and punishments for lapses in diligence. Corporal punishment was not uncommon, though tempered by the recognition that an heir's body was considered the property of the realm. A bruised prince might have been seen as unseemly, but a careless heir was far more dangerous. Ceremonies marked the milestones of youth. Boys were often knighted in their teenage years, a rite of passage. Blending pageantry with expectation, girls were formally introduced to court at similar ages, where their comportment was scrutinized as preparation for diplomatic marriages. These transitions were moments when childhood faded into public life, when a private individual was transformed into a public symbol. For many, adolescence brought an early taste of political responsibility. A prince might be sent to govern a small territory, both as training and as proof of his competence. A princess might be betrothed while still in her teens, her future sealed in a treaty that carried the weight of kingdoms. These were not symbolic gestures. They were the binding of youthful lives to dynastic necessity, and yet, within this structure of duty, there were glimpses of struggle. Letters written by young royals reveal longing for freedom, for warmth from parents often absent, for the simplicity of friendship unmarred by politics. Some bore the burden with patience, others chafed against it, earning reputations for rebellion or frivolity. The expectations of kingship or queenship loomed, but adolescence carried the same turbulence it always has, made heavier by the eyes of entire nations watching. The risks were immense. A careless word at court could be reported and remembered. A reckless decision in youth might shadow a reign. Royal childhoods were not training grounds in private but public rehearsals for sovereignty. Every stumble could become a story, every lesson a test with real consequences. And so, as we follow these children of crowns into their teenage years, the question sharpens. When they stood on the threshold of power, were they truly prepared to rule, or were they forever shaped, for better or worse, by the rigid lessons of their childhood? The transition from childhood to rule was rarely gentle. One day, a royal child might still be seen as dependent on tutors and guardians. The next, the crown rested upon their head, and the kingdom looked to them for guidance. This shift could come suddenly through the death of a parent or a crisis in succession, or it could arrive gradually, with duties layered on year after year until the moment of coronation felt inevitable. Some heirs were children in name only, carrying real responsibilities long before adulthood. Edward VI of England ascended the throne at just 9 years old. Though a council governed in his name every act of state, his childhood had been filled with books, tutors, and strict Protestant training. And as king, he carried those lessons forward, though his reign was short, ending before he reached manhood. Others, like the young Louis XIV of France, inherited crowns in childhood but grew into their power, their early years marked by regents and advisors who shaped policy until they came of age. For daughters of royalty, the shift often meant departure rather than coronation. A princess's childhood ended with marriage, her identity subsumed into that of a foreign court. Catherine of Aragon left Spain for England as a teenager, carrying with her not just a trousseau, but the expectations of 2 kingdoms. Her upbringing, in piety and obedience, prepared her to endure the difficulties of her later life, yet also limited her freedom. To be a royal daughter was to be raised as a living treaty, her personal desires secondary to dynastic need. The effectiveness of royal upbringing varied widely. Some children thrived under their rigid educations, becoming disciplined rulers with deep knowledge of governance. Others, stifled by the constraints of childhood, rebelled or faltered. Richard II of England, groomed for kingship from youth, grew into a ruler whose insecurity and vanity undermined his reign. In contrast, Elizabeth I, who had survived a perilous childhood of uncertainty and danger, drew on those experiences to become a shrewd and resilient queen. The training of childhood also left marks beyond politics. Royal tastes in art, architecture, and religion were shaped by their earliest lessons. A king taught to value learning might found universities. A queen trained in piety might sponsor religious reforms. Childhood lessons in music or poetry could blossom into cultural golden ages under their reigns. Conversely, neglected or poorly taught heirs could leave legacies of instability and decline. But royal childhoods carried costs. The burden of constant scrutiny, the lack of parental intimacy, and the weight of dynastic duty often produced rulers who struggled with trust, isolation, or ruthlessness. Behind the glitter of crowns were individuals whose earliest memories were of responsibility rather than freedom. In some ways, they never escaped the nursery, still bound by the expectations that had been woven around them before they could walk. The broader impact of these childhoods stretched across history. Dynasties rose and fell on the strength or weakness of heirs. A well-prepared child could stabilize a kingdom. An ill-prepared one could plunge it into chaos. The survival of nations sometimes rested on whether a 6-year-old had been taught to read scripture or wield a sword. And so the story of royal childhoods is not one of toys and playrooms, but of preparation, anxiety, and sacrifice. It is the story of lives shaped before they could choose their paths, of thrones inherited not by merit but by birth. Some wore the crown well, others poorly, but all were bound by the circumstances of their youth. As you imagine a royal cradle, gilded and guarded, ask yourself, if you had been born into such a world, would you have welcomed the destiny laid before you, or longed for the freedom of an ordinary childhood, unburdened by the weight of a crown? Story 6. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, the king who slept through his duties. Story 6. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, the king who slept through his duties. Wenceslaus IV was born in 1361 into one of the most illustrious families of Europe. His father, Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, was a ruler of towering reputation. Charles was a careful builder of dynasties, a patron of learning and architecture, and a man who left Prague richer, stronger, and more splendid than ever before. For his son, Wenceslaus, the path to greatness seemed secure. From his earliest days, Wenceslaus was treated not as an ordinary child, but as an heir. His name itself carried symbolic weight. Wenceslaus was named for Saint Wenceslaus, the martyred, Duke of Bohemia, patron saint of the Czech people. It was a name meant to inspire reverence and loyalty, tying the boy's identity to the very heart of Bohemia's sacred history. His childhood was one of privilege. Charles IV ensured that his son was surrounded by tutors, clerics, and advisors who could instruct him in the arts of kingship. The court at Prague was a lively and cultured place, filled with scholars from across Europe. Wenceslaus grew up hearing Latin prayers, watching tournaments in the palace courtyard, and learning the rituals of governance. He was crowned King of Bohemia when he was only 2 years old, a symbolic act meant to secure his future. Later, at the age of 15, he was elected King of the Romans, the traditional title for the heir to the Holy Roman Empire. Few youths in Europe seemed more destined for power. Yet behind these glittering beginnings lay a weakness. Where Charles IV was industrious and disciplined, Wenceslaus was indolent and temperamental. Chronicles describe him as impulsive, prone to anger, and more interested in leisure than duty. He was intelligent and capable when pressed, but he lacked the steadiness required to govern a realm as fractious as the empire. Bohemia itself was no easy inheritance. Though wealthy and strategically important, it was a land of competing factions, nobles eager for influence, towns filled with German merchants alongside Czech burghers, and a church growing restless under calls for reform. It was a country that needed careful balancing, and Wenceslaus proved ill-suited to the task. In his early years as king, he displayed moments of promise. He patronized scholars, continued his father's building projects, and maintained a glitter of magnificence at court. Yet he also revealed troubling habits. He withdrew from affairs of state for long periods, preferring hunting or drinking to councils. He relied heavily on favorites, granting them privileges that angered the nobility. When pressed to act decisively, he often delayed, avoided, or gave in to whichever faction seemed most pressing. His relationship with the Church was equally uneasy. While Charles IV had cultivated strong ties with the papacy, Wenceslaus quarreled with bishops and resisted ecclesiastical authority. He interfered in appointments, angering clerical leaders, and his indifference to reform alienated both conservative churchmen and those calling for change. The seeds of religious upheaval that would later bloom in Bohemia under Jan Hus were already being sown in his reign. Abroad, his position as king of the Romans faltered. German princes grew impatient with his inattention and when disputes flared among imperial cities or noble houses, Wenceslaus was expected to mediate, but too often he failed to appear, or arrived only after crises had worsened. The empire, a fragile web of allegiances, began to unravel under his neglect. Contemporaries noted his fondness for drink. Stories circulated of councils delayed because the king had overindulged the night before, of audiences cut short because he preferred the company of his hunting dogs to his ministers. Some chroniclers accused him of outright debauchery. Others painted him as merely lazy, preferring comfort to the hard labor of rule. Whatever the truth, the image of a king more devoted to his pleasures than his duties hardened over time. Yet it would be too simple to dismiss him entirely. Wenceslaus was not without ability. He could be shrewd in negotiation when roused, and he defended the rights of Czech nobles against foreign interference. He understood, perhaps better than his father, the growing resentment between Germans and Czechs in his kingdom, and he sometimes sought to favor native Bohemians. But his lack of consistency undermined these efforts, leaving him remembered less for what he accomplished than for what he abandoned. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, Europe was entering a time of upheaval. The papacy divided. In schism, the empire fractured, and reformist voices rising from Prague's university halls. Wenceslaus, who might have guided his realms through these storms, seemed instead to drift through them, half awake, as if his crown were a burden he never wanted to carry. And so the question arises, was Wenceslaus simply a weak king in a difficult age? Or was his neglect a spark that allowed the fires of religious and political conflict to spread unchecked in Bohemia and beyond? The early promise of Wenceslaus's reign slowly gave way to a long and uneasy decline. By the late 1380s, both his kingdom of Bohemia and the wider Holy Roman Empire had grown weary of his absence of leadership. What began as impatience with his delays hardened into anger at his neglect, and eventually into outright rebellion. In Bohemia, the nobility grew restless. Wenceslaus relied heavily on favorites, elevating men of lesser birth to positions of power. These courtiers benefited from royal grants of land, privileges, and influence, provoking the ire of established lords. The high nobility, proud of their lineage and jealous of their rights, saw in Wenceslaus a king who squandered authority. Their complaints were not only about favoritism, but about justice. Wenceslaus's courts were irregular, his enforcement of laws inconsistent, and his punishments arbitrary. For nobles who depended on law to protect their lands, this was intolerable. The burghers of Prague and other towns fared little better. Taxes rose, while royal attention fell. Trade disputes were left unresolved, and city councils often had to manage matters themselves. The bustling, mercantile life of Prague could not mask the fact that the crown's hand had grown weak. In times of unrest, the king was absent or distracted, leaving cities to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, in the empire, Wenceslaus's authority crumbled. As king of the Romans, he was meant to arbitrate disputes among princes and cities, defend the rights of the church, and represent stability. Yet, when conflicts erupted, he was often late or indifferent. The most glaring failure was his handling of the Western Schism. Since 1378, Christendom had been divided between rival popes in Rome and Avignon. The empire looked to Wenceslaus for guidance, but he hesitated, changed sides, and ultimately satisfied no one. German princes, frustrated by his indecision, began to consider alternatives. Tensions in Bohemia came to a head in 1394. A coalition of nobles, fed up with Wenceslaus's governance, captured him in Prague and held him prisoner. Known as the League of Lords, these magnates sought to control the kingdom in his stead. For a time, the king of Bohemia was reduced to a captive in his own realm, the authority of the crown broken by aristocratic power. Though he was eventually released, his weakness had been exposed. The nobility knew they could act against him without fear of lasting retribution. The Germans went further. In 1400, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire declared Wenceslaus deposed as king of the Romans. They accused him of neglect, incompetence, and failure to uphold justice. In his place, they chose Rupert of the Palatinate. It was a humiliation without precedent, a king deposed not for tyranny or scandal, but for idleness. Though Wenceslaus continued to call himself king of the Romans, his authority in Germany was effectively gone. Back in Bohemia, the troubles deepened. The university at Prague had become a center of theological debate. Scholars questioned the wealth of the clergy, the corruption of church offices, and the need for reform. Among them was Jan Hus, a preacher who would soon ignite a movement that shook Christendom. Wenceslaus might have mediated between the reformers and the established church, but his inconsistent policies only added fuel to the fire. At times, he seemed to tolerate reformist ideas. At others, he suppressed them under pressure from bishops. His vacillation pleased neither side. Chroniclers paint a picture of a king increasingly withdrawn. Hunting excursions and drinking bouts occupied his time while affairs of state languished. He was not without bursts of energy. Occasionally, he acted decisively, punishing nobles or intervening in disputes. But these moments were unpredictable, flashes of authority followed by long stretches of neglect. His temper was quick and sometimes violent, alienating those who sought his favor. The Queen, Sophia of Bavaria, provided some stability at court, but she could not mend the widening fractures. Factions of nobles and clerics maneuvered around the inattentive king, each seeking to wield influence. What remained of royal dignity was gradually consumed by disorder by the first years of the 15th century. Wenceslaus had lost the German crown, lost the trust of his nobility, and stood at the edge of losing control over Bohemia itself. Yet still he clung to his throne in Prague, reluctant to surrender what little remained of his authority. And so the question lingers. Was Wenceslaus the victim of forces larger than himself, the schism in the church, the ambition of nobles, the turbulence of his age, or was his own neglect the very thing that allowed these forces to overwhelm him? Life in a monastery was measured not by the sun, but by the toll of bells. A monk's day began in darkness, often long before dawn. The first bell called them to matins, the night prayer, when they gathered in the chapel to chant psalms. Their voices echoed off cold stone, weaving sound into silence. Then, after brief rest or more prayer, the day unfolded in carefully arranged intervals, lauds at sunrise, prime at the first hour, and so on, until compline at night. This division of time was both spiritual and practical, ensuring that no part of the day went unused. Amid these hours of devotion, the work of the scriptorium fit like another form of prayer. Copying was not simply a task, it was a discipline of obedience and humility. A monk bent over parchment was thought to be serving God as surely as when he knelt in the chapel. Every word written was both preservation of knowledge and an offering of labor. Yet the work had its own tolls. The rooms were cold in winter, drafts creeping in through narrow windows. In summer, the air grew heavy, and flies hovered over the inkpots. Light was precious, and scribes angled their desks toward the small slits of windows to catch what they could. Candles and oil lamps were used sparingly, for they smoked the parchment and drained resources. So monks strained their eyes, squinting over letters in half-light. Meals were plain and brief. Bread, beans, and watered ale were common. Sometimes fish or cheese, if the monastery was prosperous. Silence was observed even while eating. One monk might read aloud from a sacred text while the others chewed, so that even nourishment of the body was joined to nourishment of the mind. Hunger was a frequent companion, for fasting and abstinence were part of the monastic rhythm. A scribe, returning to his desk after such meals, worked with a stomach never quite full. The physical strain of copying was immense. The ink could smear, parchment could tear, and mistakes demanded careful correction. Some left notes at the ends of manuscripts. "Now I have written all," another wrote, "the end of the book. Thanks be to God. Let the reader not blame me for the errors." These small asides remind us that, beneath the anonymity of monastic discipline, human weariness was always present. Training was long. Young novices first learned to prepare parchment, scraping skins smooth and cutting them to size. They practiced forming letters slowly, row after row, until their handwriting was steady. Only then could they join the labor of copying sacred texts. Accuracy was paramount. A single miswritten word in Scripture was no small error. It risked distorting divine truth. Senior monks checked their work carefully, comparing each line to the exemplar. This process was painstaking but necessary, for books were not only precious but sacred. Despite the strictness, there were small freedoms. In the margins, scribes sometimes doodled or added personal notes, a drawing of a mouse stealing grain, a monk chasing a goose, or a fantastical beast with too many heads might appear beside solemn scripture. These playful intrusions reveal a glimpse of personality, otherwise suppressed by the uniform life of the cloister. The monotony could also bring unexpected reflections. A monk tracing the same letters over and over might drift into meditation. Each curve of ink became a form of prayer, his body weary but his mind seeking devotion. To outsiders, the labor looked dull, but to those inside the cloister, it was obedience and persistence. Books produced in these scriptoria were objects of great value, bound in wooden boards, covered with leather, clasped with bronze fittings, and sometimes adorned with jewels. They were as much treasure as text. Even the simplest book represented countless hours of labor. To lose one to fire or theft was a calamity. Monks sometimes carried books with them in flight from raiders, clutching them as one might clutch food or family. For the outside world, these manuscripts were threads of continuity. A nobleman might request a psalter for private devotion. A scholar might borrow a copy of a Roman historian. A church might treasure a book of Gospels. The slow labor of the scriptorium reached far beyond monastery walls, though its makers rarely left the cloister. And so the rhythm continued. Prayer, work, meals, more prayer, more work. Each day was much like the last, and each book copied was one more stone added to the great wall against forgetting. But this raises a question. In the quiet repetition of hours, did the monks ever wonder if the world outside even noticed their toil? Or was the act of copying, line by line, its own reward, even if no reader ever knew the name of the one who wrote it? The monasteries of medieval Europe were islands of order in seas of uncertainty. Wars swept through kingdoms, dynasties rose and fell, towns burned and were rebuilt. Yet inside cloisters, the scratching of quills persisted with steady rhythm. The monks who copied until their hands ached were not merely filling shelves. They were preserving fragments of a fragile inheritance. Much of what we know today about the ancient world comes to us because a monk once bent over a desk. Roman historians, Greek philosophers, early Christian theologians, their words survived through the act of copying. Without this labor, works of Aristotle, Cicero, and Augustine might have vanished altogether. When the Western Roman Empire fell, literacy dwindled outside clerical circles. In villages, spoken memory carried stories forward, but written knowledge was perilously thin. The monasteries kept the thread unbroken. Still, preservation was selective. Not every text was deemed worthy of copying. Sacred scripture was the highest priority, followed by the writings of the Church Fathers. Some monasteries, particularly those in Ireland and later at centers like Monte Cassino and Cluny, also valued classical works. Others saw pagan writings as distractions or even dangers. This filtering means that vast swaths of ancient literature disappeared simply because no scribe chose to preserve them. Whole plays of Sophocles, treatises on science, and records of lost kingdoms may have been consigned to silence. Those works that did survive often carried marks of their passage. A copied text was not identical to its exemplar. Words were misspelled, lines skipped, or phrases rephrased. Over generations of copying, texts shifted subtly. A scholar today might trace how a single mistake rippled forward, replicated across Europe as one monastery borrowed from another. Each book became a palimpsest of human error and perseverance. Illuminated manuscripts offered another layer of endurance. Beyond words, the artistry of monks ensured that books were objects of awe. Gold leaf sparkled in candlelight. Intricate borders, wound with vines and beasts, turned each page into a miniature world. It was devotion. A book adorned was a book revered, less likely to be discarded. Thus, art itself became a shield of preservation. Yet, for all this endurance, the scribes themselves were seldom remembered. The names of rulers and bishops were recorded, but the men who spent their lives in copying remain mostly anonymous. Occasionally, a scribe left a small plea in the margin, "Pray for me, a sinner," or, "Whoever reads this, remember the hand that wrote it." Such notes are whispers from centuries past, voices of laborers who sought at least a fragment of recognition. The spread of knowledge was gradual. A book copied in a monastery might be carried by a traveling scholar, or presented to a noble patron, or sent to another abbey. Over time, these texts formed the backbone of medieval learning. When universities began to flourish in the 12th century, they built their libraries on the work of centuries of monastic copying. Every disputation, every lecture, every student poring over Aristotle in Paris owed a debt to nameless scribes. But change was inevitable. By the 15th century, the invention of the printing press transformed the landscape of knowledge. What had once taken months or years to copy could now be reproduced in days. The labor of monks with cramped fingers was swiftly outpaced by presses turning out hundreds of pages. Some monasteries embraced the new technology. Others resisted. Slowly, the scriptorium faded into history, its role supplanted by movable type. Still, the legacy remained. Without the centuries of copying, there would have been no texts to print. Gutenberg's press owed its foundation to the silent toil of monks. Their work bridged the gap between antiquity and modernity, ensuring that when the world was ready for books in abundance, there were books to print. And so, when you think of the medieval monastery, you might imagine long corridors, the smell of ink, the dim light of a narrow window, and a figure hunched in patience. Line after line, word after word, day after day, an unbroken rhythm of endurance. It was not glamorous, not dramatic, often dull and painful. Yet from such dullness flowed the survival of civilization's memory. Perhaps the most curious thought is this: how much of our own world depends on equally unnoticed labor? Just as monks once bent over parchment without knowing how their work would shape the future, so to do countless hands today build foundations we take for granted. The monks who copied until their hands ached remind us that history's endurance often lies not in glory, but in persistence. And here the story closes. The manuscripts bound in leather, the margins filled with forgotten doodles, the hands long turned to dust. Only the words remain silent but enduring. As the 15th century advanced, Bohemia became the uneasy stage for a drama that would shake Europe. The rise of reformist voices, the deepening corruption of the church, and the resentment of nobles all converged during Wenceslaus IV's waning reign. If the earlier years had revealed his weaknesses, these final decades made them undeniable. The figure at the center of this brewing storm was Jan Hus, preaching at Bethlehem Chapel in Prague. Hus spoke of a church burdened by wealth and in need of spiritual renewal. His sermons drew crowds of burghers, artisans, and students, appealing to the discontent of ordinary people. To them, Hus gave voice to frustrations that had simmered for years: the high cost of indulgences, the moral failings of priests, and the heavy hand of Rome in local affairs. Wenceslaus's position was awkward. On one hand, he resented the power of the clergy, who resisted his efforts to tax church property. Supporting reformers might weaken the church and strengthen his control. On the other hand, openly defying Rome risked excommunication and isolation. In Christendom, his solution was characteristically inconsistent, tolerating Hus and his followers at times, yet abandoning them under pressure from church authorities. In 1412, the selling of indulgences in Prague became a flashpoint. Hus condemned the practice, and riots broke out. Students and townsfolk clashed with officials, while the king hesitated. Wenceslaus eventually ordered the suppression of the riots, but the damage was done. The division between reformers and loyalists had grown into a chasm at court. Wenceslaus grew increasingly withdrawn. Chroniclers describe him as heavy with drink, often hunting or indulging in pastimes, while matters of state slipped further into neglect. He suffered bouts of ill temper and depression, alternating between bursts of rage and long spells of indifference. Those who served him never knew whether they would find a decisive monarch or a lethargic recluse, yet his queen, Sophia of Bavaria, played a more active role during these years. Sympathetic to some of Hus's ideas, she tried to mediate between factions, though her efforts often faltered against entrenched interests. She also acted as Wenceslaus's representative when he was too ill or disinterested to govern. In this, Sophia revealed what many already suspected: the strength of the Bohemian crown no longer came from its king, but from those around him. Events outside Bohemia worsened his predicament. His younger brother, Sigismund, King of Hungary, grew in influence and ambition. Where Wenceslaus faltered, Sigismund pressed forward. It was Sigismund who took a leading role in imperial politics, eventually securing the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The contrast between the energetic younger brother and the passive elder could not have been clearer. In 1414, the Council of Constance convened to resolve the Western Schism and to deal with heresies. Jan Hus traveled there under a safe conduct from Sigismund, but was seized, tried, and burned at the stake in 1415. News of Hus's execution reverberated through Bohemia. Far from extinguishing reform, it fanned the flames of resistance. Hus's followers, outraged at his death, began organizing what would soon become the Hussite movement, a religious and national uprising that would dominate Bohemian history for decades. Where was Wenceslaus during this upheaval? Paralysis defined his reaction. Though angered by the council's treatment of a Bohemian subject, he lacked the strength to confront Sigismund or the church. In Prague, unrest swelled. Reformers challenged clerics. Nobles aligned with one side or the other, and the fragile authority of the crown seemed ready to snap. The breaking point came in 1419. On a hot July day, a mob of Hussites stormed the new town hall in Prague, hurling Catholic councillors from the windows, the infamous First Defenestration of Prague. It was an act of shocking violence, signaling the beginning of open rebellion. When word of the defenestration reached Wenceslaus at his country retreat, he was said to have flown into a fit of rage. Yet the fury passed quickly, and within days, his health gave way. On the 16th of August, 1419, the king, who had slept through so many of his duties, died suddenly, likely of a stroke. He was 58 years old. His death left Bohemia leaderless at the very moment of greatest crisis. Sigismund claimed the throne, but he was despised by the Hussites, who blamed him for Hus's execution. The kingdom descended into the Hussite Wars, a bloody and protracted conflict that would define the first half of the 15th century. Thus ended the reign of Wenceslaus IV, not with a decisive act, but with silence. He had inherited a brilliant legacy from his father, Charles IV, but left behind a fractured kingdom, a smoldering rebellion, and a tarnished crown. Looking back, one cannot help but wonder, had Wenceslaus shown steadiness, even a modest diligence? Might Bohemia have avoided the fires of revolt? Or was the Hussite storm too great for any monarch to contain? History leaves us only the image of a king remembered less for his deeds than for his absence. A ruler who slept as the world around him caught fire. You've been listening to Boring Past Times, where history drifts as quietly as candle smoke. We leave Wenceslaus IV in the stillness of his final days, his crown slipping from his hand, his kingdom tumbling toward the Hussite fires. The story may fade into silence now, but history continues in its slow, relentless march. Until next time, rest well, and may the quiet corners of the past keep you company.